Good afternoon. Today's lecture on town planning is going to be an overview of the subject, which is an elective in the final year of the Polytechnic education program. So, what really is town planning? It will be in 5 parts. Introduction to town planning. The second will be constraints on the city form, which really will discuss that what are the constraints on town planning. The third will be elements of urban structure, as to what are the structuring or the defining elements of a city or a town. The fourth would be contributors. Who are the people who have contributed to the subject of town planning? And last but not the least will be number 5, that is tools. Tools really means what are the instruments or what are the mechanics that we utilize in order to shape a town, or in order to beautify a town, or in order to make the town mechanism work in a proper manner. Well, the picture on the right shows us the wonderful Stonehenge, which is in England. The building of cities has had a long and complex history, and the Stonehenge today is the earliest remains of what was the first utilization of land in order to appropriate it so that man could define territory and make a city. Although city planning as an organized profession has existed far less than a century only, all cities display various degrees of conscious design in their layout and in the functioning. So, settlements between 8,000 to 10,000 years ago was the formation of the Stonehenge, and this was followed just before man was a hunter, he was a food gatherer, then he became an agrarian settler, and he divided land for rectilinear plotting like the Egyptians did for making rectilinear cities, of which Kahun is a very famous example. Early humans, as I just mentioned, led a nomadic existence. They were relying themselves for food on hunting, gathering for sustenance. So, from the nomad, he became a food gatherer, and then from there he became a hunter, and then when he had to have a settled existence, that was the formation of the first cities. And a systematic cultivation of plants and domestication of animals allowed for more permanent settlement. So, one can understand here that the cause of the settlement, or the principal reason behind the formation of a town, was that the pattern of sustenance depended upon the growth of plants, the annual cycle of laying plants, putting in the seeds, seeing how they would grow, and then the next crop, and so on and so forth. So, it is the idea of cultivation which really leads man to have a settled existence from his nomadic food hunting, gathering existence, and this permanent settlement makes the city a provider for human sustenance. During the 4th millennium BC, the requirements for urban revolution were finally met. So, what was happening? When there was a permanent settlement taking place, man as a food gatherer became a food grower. So, when he became a food grower, there was a need for plotting, for dividing land as to whose land would be there for agriculture and who would be the farmer for it. So, which really means the first method or the first layout of the town as an area where food production would take place. So, which really means the formal utilization of land for the creation of territory, which would define that this is my field and that is your field. So, the plough, which we see as a generation, the plough, the potter's wheel, the loom, and finally metallurgy. All these were the instruments and the technological advances which really led to the creation of the city. So, it is technology, it is social customs. For example, the pharaohs in Egypt, they decided in the valley of the Nile that this was the place where agriculture would take place. This was the place where the bricks would be manufactured. This was the place where the gods would be worshipped, and so on and so forth. So, the appropriation of territory within a city or a town has its basis in man's plough, in man's potter's wheel, in the loom, and in metallurgy. So, cities then came to be existing for many reasons. They became centers of storage, they became centers of trade and commerce, they became centers of manufacture, The agricultural surplus from the surrounding countryside was processed and distributed in cities. For example, the caravanserai cities. You see, it was very important that when you came to a town, the town was in the desert, the town was at the oasis. In the trade routes, for example, the Silk route which went through India to China, or the spice route, or the other routes that one sees in the northern regions of Iran and Iraq and Syria and so on and so forth, these all were dependent upon the camel. So, the camel and then the caravanserai. So, the caravanserai really formulated the reason for the first settlement to come up, because people would only travel by the daylight. As soon as night came, they halted, put up their tents, and that was the formation of the first caravanserai or the travelers' inn. So, who were the people who travelled? They were the tradesmen. Who were the people who travelled between China to across the Mongolian desert and came to Saudi Arabia and then further went into the Caspian and the Mediterranean lands? These were the traders. Or they would come till a certain point and then cross over, exchange goods and go back. So, Chinese silk and incense travelled all the way up from the northern parts, came across the passes that you heard of, came to Turkmenistan, came to the fortresses of Nisa, and finally they were brought into the Mediterranean. So, this way exchange in cities began, and that is how the exchange of culture, of exchange of tradition also started. So, what you see on the right is Jericho. Jericho in Israel is 9000 BC. So, that was one of the earliest cities that came up, and it was here that one would constantly see the oldest civilization, and even till date Jericho is a living city. Towns were founded at the intersection, as I said, of transportation routes or at points where goods must shift from one place to another by transportation, and the river and the ocean, the ports became the major ones. For example, the Greek cities like Miletus. Miletus was a very strong hold, like Athens was a very strong hold because they had great harbors, and at these harbors they created great ports, and this was the reason that Miletus was actually a very strong place with 3 ports, not 1, 2, but 3 ports. Religion also plays a very important role throughout urban history. Ancient sacred places, for example, we housed the Parthenon of Greece in the most important vantage point, the highest point, because it was the place of prayer. So, the religion also became a very important element in the focus of determination of the town. The location of the town, so everybody looked towards the citadel or the highest point. The castle cities, these were also very important. So, ancient cities which had large temple precincts, they were had large monumental religious buildings, and medieval cities which built monasteries. For example, in India we have Nalanda and Takshila. These are very great examples of university towns. So, religion, universities, education, all these are actually factors which determine the town planning of any city. Religious elements have been crucial throughout urban history, and monasteries, cathedrals, Montpazier, for example, these are all examples of medieval cities. Fayum, what you see on the right, is 5000 BC, even a living city till date. It is a city in Middle Egypt located 130 kilometers southwest of modern day Cairo. It was founded in 4000 BC. It is the oldest city in Egypt and one of the oldest cities in Africa. So, what was this? What was Fayum? Fayum was an oasis in the middle of the desert. So, there was a need for sustenance, and sustenance was there because the oasis had water in it, and that was what the shepherds needed for their cattle as well as for their own tents. Towns also provided protection. What you see on the right is the Great Wall of China. So, protection was required because as the town grew, it started having invaders, because the town was a place of produce, it was a town of riches. So, during attacks, the rural population could flee behind the city walls. So, the creation of city walls, the manufacture of large strongholds became actually the method to repel the enemy. And in India too, we have a very famous example, that is that of the forts. The Fort William, for example, in Madras, then you have the Chennai fort, then you have the Bombay fort, then you have the Calcutta fort. So, wherever the British came, they established forts, And what were these forts? They were basically, Pondicherry also has a port. All these forts had these strong walls. So, these were the walls which provided protection to the town within and from the invaders outside. But these walls actually occupied a lot of space, and when the change of warfare or artillery grew, we will find that these walls became redundant. And when they became redundant, you had examples. For example, very famous example that you have is the Ringstrasse, as a result of which you have Vienna. The city of Vienna has a large open space all around its city called the Ringstrasse now, which was when they pulled down the walls, they realized that there was a lot of open space, vacant open space around the city center, which was left for the production of more buildings. So, these walls were there, they are called crenellated walls. So, what are they? These star shaped cities were made. So, this was the first wall, then came the second wall, the third wall, and so on and so forth. So, this entire walled city protected. Amritsar is a walled city, we know. These walls, massive walls, Patiala is a walled city, we know. All these cities that were there, especially in the medieval period when warfare was not so much, even they were still using the horseback, they were using artillery, and they were not using gunpowder. The discovery of gunpowder actually made all these walls redundant, and that is when the town planning also underwent a change. So, walls served the purpose for many years until the invention of heavy artillery rendered the walls useless, and with the advent of modern aerial warfare, you see the discovery of aerial warfare means you are using the cannonballs to actually shoot into the air and be able to destroy these walls totally. So, what you see here is a fort which is made along a shore. Okay. So, this is probably a town, the Zanzira fort in South India, which is next to the water course. So, they will have a fort wall which is within the water, and then you have more fort walls here and so on and so forth. The French military engineer Vauban is very famous for, because you see the city of the country of France is actually supposed to be a hexagon. This hexagon, which means it is bordered by countries all around. So, it needed large walls to be there, and Vauban was a French military engineer who actually devised methods of creating these strongholds called these Vauban forts. So, cities as providers of refuge are also credited to Vauban, the French military engineer. As I was talking about cities being protected, the walls, the famous Ishtar gate, and who doesn't know about the hanging gardens of Babylon, into which Babylon was a city into which where Hammurabi lived and made the Hammurabi code. So, this is the town plan of the grid plan of the city of Babylon, and the Euphrates river flows through it, and the Ishtar gate, the very famous Ishtar gate, is located somewhere here, and these are the hanging gardens that you see here, and at night the moat walls. So, this is actually a moat which was there. The moat was the gate was closed during the night, so that the enemy or the attackers could not enter, and during the day it was kept open so that you could go and interact with the hinterland around. So, once this artillery and the gunpowder was discovered, cities became prime targets for destruction rather than the safe haven. So, this is an example of Vauban that I was telling you, how in the city of Naarden, Netherlands, which also has a severe water problem, that the land is lower than the water around. So, they have to create a system of dikes whereby they keep pumping out the water so that the level of the land remains up. So, the use of natural forces as frontiers for the protection of the city. More examples, here again you find these are the walls of into which the city lies, and these are the routes along which, and this is the watercourse around it. And here you can see the walls inside, and along the walls you find the watercourses moving. Okay. Well, it does not end there. With the growth of the city, there was a need to administer people. So, we also had cities which served as centers of government. For example, our capital cities like Brasilia, like Chandigarh, like Delhi, like Canberra, like Washington DC. Washington DC's plan was basically done by Lafont, and he used the system of avenues and the obelisks to basically generate a geometry to administer the city. So, a city can also have governmental functions. Beyond that, the city is also a place where it's a mixture of people, economics, talent, social and cultural exchange takes place. So, the city of Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium, celebrates its annual flower show because the climate there is so conducive and they grow so many flowers. So, the central royal square is an international flower show that takes place till date, and it's a tradition that they have carried out for long. And flowers from here are exported all over the world. It is supposed to be a world class export center. So, see how economic surplus is giving it another look in the city planning. Cities also served as centers for communication. The ancient city of Persepolis in modern day Iran was one of the 4 capitals of the sprawling Persian Empire, and it was a showcase of the empire's staggering wealth. So, what you see along the walls of Persepolis is basically relief sculptures portraying envoys' offerings to the kings. That was the first part of the lecture, talking to us about what could be the determinants. So, we saw that the determinants were landform, the determinants were also to do with climate, the determinants were to do with the warfare, the artillery, the religion, and so on and so forth. What are the constraints on city form? Can I build a town or a city at any place? Or is it there are certain latitudes along which the first cities came up? We know that along the equatorial and the tropical region were the first cities, but today you even have cities as close to the South Pole and the North Pole. So, how is it? Has it man has overtaken nature that we have found such things? So, let us look at the constraints on city form. Machu Picchu, one of the most famous examples in the world of a city where landscape is respected, but the Inca, the warrior class, have managed to find and use the solar gain also to find and build on a terraced land on the Machu Picchu mountain range. So, moderately sloping land was there, and this urban site was spectacular, and it offered views at all points, and it was like a mountain shelf onto which the Machu Picchu's built their city. Okay. Climate. Another role or a determinant or a constraint on city form is the climate. Streets were aligned to take advantage of cool breeze. For example, the city of Jaisalmer. As you look at Shimla, we are having the climate that we are building on southern slopes and we are not building on the northern golden slopes. Then you have the cooling breeze taking place. The arcades were designed to shield pedestrians from the sun and the rain, and the architecture of individual buildings is also very important. City location was also very important. For example, the city of Banaras was along the trade city of Banaras, which also came up because of religion and because of the ghats of Banaras, is along the Ganges. And this is basically the water supplies were an important integral part of the structure of the city. The internal structure of the city was influenced by natural transportation, and the cities were sited near natural harbors or near navigable rivers. So, because the source of transportation in earlier days were boats. You know, today you have steamers and you have railroads and you have other bridges and airfare coming up, but at that point of time land routes were determined by regional topography. But at the same time, devastation, we must not forget that cyclones, earthquakes, all these factors have also to be considered. For example, in India and especially in Chandigarh, Patiala, we are having this thing of the seismic zones. So, if we are staying close to, for example, the recent Falin cyclone in Odisha just a few weeks back demonstrated how natural forces can undo decades of human labor in a very short time. So, constraints on city form can also be related to seismic forces and to the natural devastation methods. What are the elements of urban structure? There are 3 principal elements of any urban structure. One is the network, the second is the buildings, and the third is the open space. By networks, what do we mean? By networks, we mean, for example, the gridiron plan of the Indus Valley civilization or of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa is basically a network of roads. It is utilizing the natural breeze that they were able to create self-cleaning streets. Even bridges and roads and flyovers and clover leaves and so on and so forth. And you have the metro running overhead, you have a bridge below, you have the ring road below, you have a fast traffic artery, and underneath the earth's surface also there is a tube running. For example, the city of London, the city of Paris, at one point of time there are almost 7 layers of circulation or transportation networks which are running there. They carry foot traffic, they carry carts, they carry vehicles, they carry car loads, these are all nothing but transportation channels. And they could be 10-lane freeways to sidewalks. They could be a pathway in the Leisure Valley, it could be a road, it could be V1 to V7 in Chandigarh, it could be the MG road, it could be the Queen's Necklace, the Emerald Necklace in Mumbai. All these are examples of networks or pathways. We have so many plans here. The first one is nothing but the very famous Chandigarh city plan, the gridiron plan. Then you have the Dandaka plan, which was the early town planning in South India based on the Arthashastra. Then you have a plan of Timgad, which is basically a Roman castrum or a Greek Roman military town. Then here you have the town of Peking, which was a forbidden city plan. Then you have here Jaipur, which is the 9-square grid plan with the central one given to the Royal Square, and this topography tilting the last square and reorganizing it here, and then the 3 harbors that I called of the Miletus city. So these are largely gridiron plans, but when we try and understand infrastructure, we want to say that the network is, one is the roads, but the other part of the network is utilization of water supply, utilization of sewerage, disposition of waste, how to deal with large populations and large densities, and public infrastructure, laying of telephone lines, overhead lines, electric lines, Wi-Fi lines. There are so many networks in a city that we need to take care of when we are doing town planning. Networks. These networks are important because, for example, the very famous example we see is the 1666 fire of London, after which Christopher Wren was invited to make a new plan for the city of London. So devastation of any one of these networks can actually lead to the devastation of the city. It is to say that you are dealing with number of factors together, and you need to look at how you are laying the various infrastructures, the various networks in order to create a safe city. Buildings. Buildings have been part of cities from time immemorial, and man has tried to glorify himself by creating huge buildings. For example, the picture on the right is Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, which was an engineering feat, a building which had a glass roof. Similarly, a large theatre, that is the Colosseum here. So in Rome, what are these buildings trying to say? They are trying to gather the attention of the public. We are trying to create huge structures. So what is it? These industrial houses or these buildings of social nature, what are these? These are that we need to have a proper arrangement for evacuation of people from here, for the laying out of services, for air conditioning, and so on and so forth. So these become very important matters today. Buildings further. We are not stopping to build high-rise. The Eiffel Tower was one example where Gustave Eiffel decided to tell us that as part of the expositions we would make something high-rise. But we didn't stop at that, and today we have something called the Burj Dubai. So what is it? It is a city within a building. We have hotels there, we have expositions, we have decks, we have apartments, we have multiplexes, name it, and on top of that we have huge parkings underneath these buildings. So what are these? These are actually earthquakes waiting to occur. So we need to see the relationship between the building height, the building bulk, and so on and so forth. Open spaces. Very often in a town plan, whatever is left vacant is sometimes treated as a leftover. It contributes greatly to the quality of urban life. So never think that the open space, which could be water, which could be landscape, which could be green, which could be hard, which could be soft, which could be bridges. These are all important resources for a city. So the open space of a city is actually the lung. It's the breathing part of the city. For example, the city of Chandigarh, very beautifully designed by Corbusier. It's a grid city, but do you realize that he brought in the nature into the city? This is the Leisure Valley. He brought in the Leisure Valley here bang next to the city center, and for all the sectors he had these little greens. So what do you see? You see the forest into the city. It is a city of gardens where actually we have utilized nature, brought it into the city as amenities, because this green resource is something that we always need to safeguard. The next part is contributors to town planning. We just talked about Chandigarh and Corbusier, but beyond Corbusier, before Corbusier, there were many other people. Who are these? The first was Hippodamus of Miletus. I showed you the plan of Miletus in which there were 3 harbours, but this is the plan of the city of Pyrenees, and here you can see the Pyrenees grid. So what was it? They found that for the standing armies of the Greeks and the Roman armies, they needed to have grid cities where decumanous and Cardo were the principal streets running north-south. And he basically, Hippodamus was talking about the ideal city, which would be 10,000 men, after which the city would be built at another place, and it also included corresponding women, children and slaves to reach 50,000. The minute it would reach 50,000, they would abandon and they would build a new city. Okay? And the land was also divided into 3 parts: the sacred land, the public land and the private land. The next person who contributed was Vitruvius. Vitruvius was, you must have heard about the 10 books of Vitruvius, and he presented his De Architectura to Augustus. Augustus was a very famous ruler of the Romans, and later on 1684 we have this depiction of Vitruvius on the right. You see, this is Vitruvius and he is presenting to the emperors here as to how this whole idea of sun, wind patterns and the building of orientation of buildings should be arranged to correspond to the sun and the wind movement. So he called it the De Architectura, which was to form the basis for city planning. So Vitruvius also defined streets. He used street scenes and called them the tragic, the comic and the satiric. The tragic were defined by the kind of architecture the street had. The satiric was the use of the landscape, and the comic was, for example, the Merchant of Venice, where Shylock tells his daughter not to go out into the street because the procession is going by, and the views in the represents the manner of ordinary dwellings. Leonardo Battista Alberti. Alberti was an Italian architect. He distilled the knowledge of ancient Greeks and Romans on the subject and added his own observations. This is his system of proportioning that he did for the church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and one finds the character and the environment of cities to promote health, safety, convenience, dignity and pleasure. This was Alberti in 1485. Then came Francis Bacon, and he said that nature is not to be commanded only if you obey nature. So you must not go against nature, you must have nature with you. And air pollution of 17th century London, which was basically an industrial city, a book was written called Fumi Fugium, which really corresponds to the inconvenience of the air and smoke of London, dissipated. It included the prohibition of high sulphur coal, relocation of polluting land uses like tanneries from central London to outlying areas downwind of the city, and the plantation of entire blocks with trees and flowers to sweeten the air. Evelyn was also the author of Silva 1664, which is a work on trees and their cultivation. Chandigarh also has a book called Gardens and Landscaping by M.S. Randhawa, who basically along with Le Corbusier defined what avenue would have what kind of plantation. By the 19th century, we cannot forget the changing the impact of cities was there. And we also have Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed nothing less than New York Central Park and Boston's Park. He was basically talking about separation of urban functions, spaciousness, and Frederick Law Olmsted is said to be the father of landscape architecture. He harnessed nature's processes in reclaiming land. He was also talking about, Frederick Law Olmsted talked about Boston Back Bay system, which is largely the idea of cleaning a city by employment of natural water body rather than a masonry or a flood storage water basin. So he said, don't create anything artificial. Study the flow of water, study the flow of the drainage pattern, and then according to that you should modify your system of parks in the city. So Central Park, New York City is credited to Frederick Law Olmsted. Ebenezer Howard talked about yesterday, today and tomorrow, a peaceful, pathful reform to the beautification of cities. So he said that living and working in the smoke is not good. Today we are living in the suburbs and working in the smoke, and tomorrow we want to live and work in the sun. This was about Welwyn, the garden city, and Ebenezer Howard is supposed to be the pioneer of the garden city movement, and along with him there was another person called Patrick